On December 6, 1907, the ground beneath Monongah, West Virginia, shook with a force that would rewrite American history. What happened that morning was not just a mining accident. It was the unraveling of an entire community's soul. This is the story of the men who went underground and never came back, of the women who waited at the mine gates until their knees gave way, and of the children who learned too soon what grief tasted like. Welcome to Monongah. Monongah in 1907 was a town built entirely on black gold. The Fairmont Coal Company operated mines number 6 and number 7 side by side along the Monongahela River, and nearly every man in town worked beneath the earth. Immigrants flooded in from Italy, Poland, Hungary, and a dozen other nations, drawn by the promise of steady wages. They brought their languages, their saints, their superstitions, and they left them all behind when they descended into the dark. The mines were the heartbeat of Monongah, and on that cold Friday morning, that heartbeat stopped. Before the explosion, there was routine. Every morning, hundreds of men would gather at the mine entrance, lamps fastened to their caps, lunch pails in hand, bodies braced for another shift in the belly of the earth. Many were barely 18. Some were younger, boys who passed as men because their families needed the money. The Italian workers called their section of the mine La Buca, the hole. They went in singing sometimes, notes echoing off the wet stone walls. Peter Riccio was one of them. 23 years old, he had emigrated from Calabria just 2 years earlier. He sent most of his wages home to his mother, kept just enough to sleep and eat. On December 5th, he wrote a letter home describing the smell of pine smoke and snow. He mentioned that his boots had finally dried out after the previous week's flooding. He sealed the letter and tucked it into his coat pocket. He never mailed it. The letter was found on him 3 weeks later, still sealed, pulled from the wreckage. The exact cause of the explosion has never been definitively proven, but investigators pointed to a deadly combination: accumulated methane gas ignited by either a miner's open-flame lamp or an electrical spark from the mine's primitive rail system. What followed was not one explosion, but a chain reaction that tore through miles of underground tunnels in seconds. The blast forced a wall of superheated air through every passage, burning oxygen and replacing it with carbon monoxide, the silent killer that finished what the fire started. At 10:28 a.m., residents above ground heard a sound like thunder. Windows cracked, dogs bolted. The earth seemed to exhale. A column of coal dust and black smoke erupted from the mine shafts, visible for miles. Women dropped what they were doing and ran. Children followed, not understanding but feeling the cold weight of something wrong. Within minutes, every person in Monongah was at the mine gates, and the gates were shut. The mine company officials arrived quickly. Their first priority was not rescue, it was damage assessment. How badly were the shafts compromised? Could production resume? These cold calculations played out in real time, while wives, mothers, and children pressed their faces against the iron fence and screamed names into the smoke. Maria Catanzaro arrived, still holding a soup ladle, steam rising from her hands in the December air. Her husband, Giuseppe, had gone down that morning. She would not move from that gate for 36 hours. Rescue teams, when they finally descended, found conditions unlike anything they had prepared for. The tunnels were choked with afterdamp, the deadly mixture of gases left behind after a coal explosion. Canaries brought down in cages dropped from their perches within minutes. The rescuers themselves were forced back repeatedly, retreating to the surface, gasping, only to descend again. Every man who entered that mine in those first hours was taking a gamble with their own life to search for men who, in most cases, were already gone. The official death toll settled at 362, but historians and community researchers believe the true number was much higher, possibly over 500. The discrepancy exists because mine records of that era were notoriously inconsistent. Boys who worked unofficially, men who had started just that day, undocumented immigrants who were paid off the books. None of them appeared in the company's ledger. They simply vanished, their absence absorbed into the silence of the mountain. Identifying the dead was a nightmare of a different kind. Many bodies were too damaged, burned, crushed, or suffocated to be identified by sight alone. Women were brought in to recognize their husbands by the shape of a hand, the patch on a boot, a distinctive scar. One woman identified her husband by the ring he wore, a simple copper band she had given him the day they married. Another recognized her brother by the way his fingers curled, an old injury that had never healed straight. Grief became forensic. Love became a method of identification. In the weeks that followed, Monongah became a community of women and children. The Fairmont Coal Company offered a death benefit, a single payment that amounted to roughly 6 weeks of a miner's wages. For widows with 4, 5, 6 children, this was an insult dressed as generosity. Many women had no English, no savings, and no family within 1,000 miles. They had followed their husbands to this strange American hill town, and now their husbands were beneath that hill forever. Some women took in boarders, others took their children and returned to their home countries, only to find they had been gone too long. The villages they remembered no longer existed in the way they had left them. A handful of women stayed and rebuilt, learning English word by word, taking in laundry, teaching their daughters to sew. The children of Monongah grew up knowing that the ground beneath their feet was not solid, that it could open at any moment, that it had already swallowed their fathers. Fairmont Coal Company never formally apologized. No executive faced criminal charges. No senior official was held personally accountable. The company cited the explosion as an unavoidable industrial accident, an act of nature rather than an act of negligence. This framing was not accidental. It was strategic. If the disaster was nobody's fault, then nobody owed anything to the dead or their families. Documents recovered years later told a different story. Ventilation in mines. Number 6 and Number 7 had been flagged as inadequate by at least 2 independent engineers in the years before the explosion. The company had received written warnings about the accumulation of explosive gases. Maintenance of the electrical systems, the most likely ignition source, had been deferred repeatedly to cut costs. The men who died in that mountain didn't die by accident. They died because safety was expensive and silence was cheap. The company chose silence. Reporters arrived within days. The images they sent back to newspapers across the country shocked a public that had grown numb to reports of industrial accidents. The sheer scale was different this time. Over 250 women widowed. Nearly 1,000 children left fatherless. A small American town hollowed out in a single morning. The photographs showed women in black pressing against the mine gates, children with blank, uncomprehending expressions, rows of rough wooden coffins in the snow. The disaster sparked a national conversation about mine safety that had been simmering for years. Reform advocates pointed to Monongah as irrefutable proof that voluntary safety standards were not enough, that without federal regulation and enforcement, coal companies would continue to prioritize tonnage over human lives. Theodore Roosevelt was president at the time, and the pressure mounted on his administration to act. Within months, Congress would pass the Bureau of Mines Act, creating the first federal agency tasked with mine safety research. It was progress, but it came too late for the men of Monongah. Among the many grim findings of the rescue operation was the evidence of how the miners had spent their final moments. Some had moved toward exits that no longer existed. Others had gathered in clusters, as if waiting together made survival more possible. A few had written notes, scratched into the coal walls or folded into pockets, messages for wives, for children, for parents they would never see again. Most were simply practical. Tell Maria I love her. The money is under the floorboard. Don't let the boys go into the mines. One message, found carved into a beam near the entrance to a collapsed section, said only, "We tried." Nobody knows who wrote it. Nobody knows whether that person was alone or with others. But those two words have outlasted the company that built the mine, the officials who ignored the warnings, and the politicians who delayed the reforms. They remain the most honest account of what happened in the deep dark of Monongah on December 6th, 1907. The explosion happened on December 6th, 18 days before Christmas. In hundreds of Monongah homes, small gifts had already been hidden away. Hand-carved toys, lengths of ribbon, oranges saved from the market. In the days after the disaster, families found these hidden preparations, presents from men who would never see them opened. Some mothers gave the gifts to their children on Christmas morning anyway, unable to explain why that was both the kindest and the cruelest thing they could do. Father Salvatore Gallipoli, the local Catholic priest, held Mass every day for weeks, in Italian and in broken Polish and in English, trying to cover every language of the dead. He later wrote in his parish diary that the hardest part was not the funerals, it was the Christmas Eve service, when children came to church clutching gifts their fathers had never given them, wearing coats their mothers had sewn from their fathers' old work shirts, because that was the only fabric available. They wore their fathers like armor, he wrote, against a cold that had nothing to do with winter. Monongah changed American labor history. The disaster, alongside others that year, including the cherry mine fire in Illinois, created enough political pressure to force real reform. The Bureau of Mines was established in 1910. Federal mine inspection powers were strengthened. The labor movement used Monongah as a rallying cry, and the push for safer working conditions gained momentum that would eventually contribute to the New Deal-era protections of the 1930s. But the families of Monongah saw little of this progress directly. The company paid minimal compensation, evicted some widows from company-owned housing within months, and continued operating in the region. The immigrants who survived returned to work in the same industry because they had no other skills and no other options. Some of the sons of Monongah's dead miners went back underground themselves, because coal was still the only work available. The system that killed their fathers was the same system they depended on to survive. Nothing about that was ironic. It was just the brutal arithmetic of poverty. Today, a small memorial stands in Monongah. It lists the names of the confirmed dead, 362 of them, etched into stone. But historians know the stone is incomplete. Somewhere in the dark, beneath that West Virginia hillside, lie the unrecorded, the undocumented, the men who existed only in the memories of women who are also now gone. The true number may never be known. That uncertainty is its own kind of monument. What happened at Monongah was not ancient history. It was 117 years ago. The grandchildren of survivors are still alive. The choices that caused those deaths, deferred maintenance, ignored warnings, profits over people, are choices still being made today in industries around the world. We remember Monongah not because history is comfortable, but because it is instructive. The men who went underground on December 6th, 1907, deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be named and known, and never reduced to a statistic. This series was their story. Remember it.